Hello. My documentary, The Man Who Knew Too Much, about Colin Wallace, the former British Army officer who blew the whistle on fake news and was framed for a murder, covered how the intelligence services and army engaged with the press to spread fake news. I wanted to share with you some more details of one of the campaigns from that documentary. One of the campaigns Colin Wallace was involved in Northern Ireland was an article published in the Sunday Telegraph titled How the IRA Gets Guns and Cash. The article was attributed to the investigative journalist Christopher Dobson, and it alleged that prominent Irish Americans and NORAID, an abbreviation for the Northern Irish Aid Committee, were directly supporting terrorism by funding the purchase of arms. What makes this article interesting is that it shows how a new reality can be created from very little actual evidence. After Colin Wallace's redundancy from information policy, he took a number of his files with him and later used those files in his fight against the Ministry of Defence. In the 1980s, the British government claimed Colin Wallace had been nothing more than a junior civil servant with a Walter Mitty complex, and they claimed he was never involved in PSYOPs and spreading fake news. When Colin Wallace first revealed he had documents from his time in PSYOPs, the government claimed that these documents were forgeries. However, an independent forensic expert dated one set of papers and ink to the time Colin Wallace claimed they had originated. A Ministry of Defence document then surfaced around 1990 referring to Colin Wallace as a senior information officer in the Ministry of Defence. So as part of making the documentary, Colin Wallace gave me access to a number of his documents. This document here is part of the research Colin Wallace claims to have supplied to the Daily Telegraph for the article How the IRA Gets Guns and Cash. This is some of the research Colin Wallace collated, which included profiles of alleged wealthy and influential US Republican sympathizers. Here are scans of two telegrams between JIS, that's the Joint Intelligence Section, MI5, MI6 at HQ Northern Ireland, and SIS in London, which was a MI6 HQ in London, discussing various aspects of the proposed article. One of the telegrams reads, "Approached Colin Wallace this morning. The managing editor is prepared to give the article wide coverage. Furthermore, their lawyers are prepared to let them name Fuller. They have asked Wallace whether he can supply any more details of property, pubs, hotels, firms, etc. owned by Fuller." So here, the Daily Telegraph is asking an intelligence operative to do more research for the article which they are publishing at the instigation of the intelligence services. And this is the resulting special investigation that was published in the Daily Telegraph attributed to Christopher Dobson. Christopher Dobson writes, "I have spent the past 2 months investigating the way in which the IRA gets its money and the way that money is used to sustain its bombers and snipers." The article is based on the information Colin Wallace and Information Policy compiled, yet there is no mention of Colin Wallace and no mention of Information Policy nor MI5 or MI6. The article is well written, and it leaves the reader with the impression that people who supported Republicans were supporting the IRA and the armed campaign against the British. The article How the IRA Gets Guns and Cash takes the example of Joe Cahill, who had been a Dublin-based trustee of the Irish Northern Aid Committee, an organisation in the US that collected money to support Republican families in Northern Ireland that had fallen on hard times as a result of the conflict. Joe Cahill was convicted of weapons smuggling, and that conviction and the fact that Joe Cahill was a trustee of the Northern Irish Aid Committee was then the basis for the argument that the Northern Irish Aid Committee was raising money to buy arms for the IRA. However, whether that weapons smuggling charge was related to money raised by NORAID was not mentioned in the article, and it is not mentioned in the briefing papers Colin Wallace supplied to the Daily Telegraph. We are simply led to imagine that that was the case. The article does not show that NORAID money was used by Cahill to buy the arms which he was convicted of smuggling, nor does it prove that NORAID and the people involved in that organisation would have approved of this. The article states Provo terrorists decide how the NORAID money is actually spent, yet the article provides no evidence for this either. Joe Cahill claimed in an interview that the money had not come from NORAID, but he said that there were groups in America outside Northern Aid who supported the IRA, but he was not prepared to divulge their names. Now, you would presume that if the money raised by NORAID was used to buy weapons, then information policy would be able to provide some kind of evidence for that, a financial trail for instance, rather than leaving everything to the imagination of the reader. The article goes on to mention a number of unnamed individuals who had allegedly been convicted of arms charges in the US, and these unknown individuals, the article alleged, were connected to NORAID. The article gave no further details and later went on to claim that active service units still operate out of the Bronx, snipers and bombers who fly to Ireland to do a job and then return to the safety of America. This, of course, is a similar theme to an earlier PSYOPs campaign covered in the documentary, where information policy claimed Eastern European trained snipers were being dropped off by Soviet submarines. All this activity, according to the briefing paper, was orchestrated by Irish National Caucus, although the article decided not to go quite that far in its allegation. Christopher Dobson then went through a number of prominent US backers of republicanism, including politicians, businessmen and lawyers, drawing on rumors that they too were involved in supporting terrorism to various degrees. Information policy briefing papers outlined one Irish-American businessman in particular, by the name of William Fuller, who was described as having blue eyes, being 5 foot 10 inches tall, being a naturalized US citizen married to Carmel Quinn, a showbiz personality. His business interests and addresses and phone number were listed. The briefing paper then claimed that William Fuller was suspected of being a member of the Provisional Army Council and was probably one of the Provisional IRA's bankers. The degree of William Fuller's involvement may have been that he posted bail for a number of people accused of Provisional IRA involvement, although none of those individuals were accused of having used a weapon. It is interesting that William Fuller's obituary in The Guardian, the link for which is in the description below, makes no mention of any of this. I quote The Guardian, "Fuller lived an extraordinary life and will be remembered as an Irish gentleman." The two telegrams I mentioned previously are interesting in that the Sunday Telegraph had requested additional photographs of Fuller. Now, Information Policy, the Army Psychological Warfare outfit, had a photographic unit that collected material for intelligence purposes. Information Policy would use those same materials from the photographic unit in press briefings. This was quite a revelation to me, that material which we are told is so secret and sensitive that it cannot even be used in a court of law, would be routinely supplied to the press to support a smear campaign. I think this should raise a few questions about what it is that intelligence services actually do and how they operate. A second point of interest in the telegram is that the editor of the Sunday Telegraph is quoted as requesting further details about the business interests of William Fuller, in effect asking Colin Wallace, an intelligence officer, to do additional research on behalf of the Sunday Telegraph. The Man Who Knew Too Much documentary mentions how information policy and British intelligence in Northern Ireland had a good understanding of the various publications, newspapers, their readership, and in many cases also the individual journalists. So they knew which publications and journalists would be interested in a certain story. And they knew that certain journalists or publications would almost publish material at request. The aim of the article, How the IRA Gets Guns and Cash, appears to have been to undermine US support for the Republican movement rather than terrorism. The investigative piece concludes with every dollar bill contributed to agencies such as NORAID contributes to the killing of Irish people, and asks, can nothing be done to counteract the hysterical propaganda that pervades the Irish communities in America? So that appears to have been the aim of the piece. It is worth considering that Christopher Dobson, the journalist and author of the article, may not have been aware of the involvement of information policy, MI5 and MI6. The story may have been handed to him by his editor. If you search for Christopher Dobson's autobiography, you will find that he used the photograph from this article as the cover for his autobiography. What is interesting about this PSYOPs campaign is that it shows how from essentially one piece of real information, the conviction of Joe Cahill for arms smuggling, suspicion can be exerted on a whole range of individuals and institutions, giving the impression of a well-funded and organized adversary despite no real evidence having been presented to support that narrative. Information policy operated under the assumption that any organisation critical of British policy was an IRA front. And this piece is a good example of how that was put into practice. That's it. If you like my content, why not join the mailing list, subscribe to my channel, or support me on Patreon.